I have spent most of my adult life as a landscape photographer, a profession that requires me to seek out the most isolated and untouched corners of the wilderness. To me, silence isn't empty, it is full of information. However, after what happened in the autumn of 2023, I've learned that some silences are heavy with a presence that should never be disturbed. I had rented a secluded cabin in the high ridges of the Appalachian Mountains, planning to stay for a month to capture the changing colors of the foliage. The cabin was a simple, sturdy structure built from heavy logs, perched on the edge of a steep drop-off that locals called the Dark Ridge. The nearest neighbor was over 5 miles down a winding, unpaved logging road. I enjoyed the isolation. For the first 2 weeks, my routine was perfect. I would wake up before dawn, hike to a vantage point, and wait for the perfect light to hit the valley below. I felt completely at peace, at least until I started reviewing my digital files on my laptop during the long, quiet evenings. It started with a photo I took on a particularly misty Tuesday. I was shooting a wide-angle landscape of the ridge when I noticed a dark shape in the corner of the frame, partially obscured by a cluster of hemlock trees. At first, I assumed it was a large black bear or perhaps a trick of the light and shadow. But as I zoomed in on the high-resolution image, my blood ran cold. The shape was upright, far too tall to be a bear, and its proportions were all wrong. It looked like a person, but the limbs were elongated, and the skin, if you could call it that, was a dull, matte black that seemed to absorb the light around it. Most disturbing of all was the posture. It wasn't just standing there, it was leaning around the trunk of the tree, staring directly at the spot where I had been standing with my tripod. I tried to rationalize it. I told myself it was a snag, a dead tree stump that just happened to look humanoid, but then I found the same shape in photos from the previous 3 days. In each image, the figure was in a different location, but always positioned at the edge of the clearing, always watching me. It had been following me for miles, staying just out of my peripheral vision while I was focused on my camera lens. That night, the silence of the cabin felt different. The thick logs that usually felt like a fortress now felt like a cage. Around 2:00 a.m., I was jolted awake by a sound that made my heart hammer against my ribs. It was a heavy, rhythmic thumping coming from directly above me. Something was on the roof. The sound wasn't the light scurrying of a squirrel or the heavy step of a raccoon. These were deliberate, weighty impacts, like a person walking on their hands and feet. I sat up in bed, gripping a heavy flashlight, watching the ceiling beams groan under the weight. The thumping moved from one end of the cabin to the other, then stopped directly over my head. I held my breath, listening, and that's when I heard it. A long, low, rasping sound like sandpaper being dragged over wood. Something was breathing just inches away from me, separated only by a layer of shingles and timber. I lay frozen in my bed, the beam of my flashlight trembling as I aimed it at the heavy timber rafters of the ceiling. The scratching sound continued for several minutes, moving with a sickening fluidity that suggested the creature had multiple limbs working in tandem. Eventually, the weight shifted, and I heard a heavy thud as whatever was on the roof leaped off and landed in the soft dirt behind the cabin. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in a chair facing the door, my hunting knife in one hand and my camera in the other, watching the window until the first rays of weak autumn sunlight filtered through the hemlocks. When morning finally came, I forced myself to go outside. I needed to see what had been on my roof. I walked around to the back of the cabin and stopped dead. There in the damp earth were impressions that made no sense. They weren't paw prints and they weren't exactly human footprints. They were long, narrow indentations with 4 distinct point marks at the front, as if something with elongated fingers had been digging into the soil for traction. Even more disturbing were the marks on the cabin itself. Deep, vertical grooves had been gouged into the heavy logs, leading all the way from the ground up to the roofline. Something had climbed the wall of the cabin like an insect. I knew I should leave right then, but a frantic, irrational part of my brain wanted proof. I was a photographer, I couldn't leave without capturing what was stalking me. I spent the day setting up several motion-activated trail cameras around the perimeter of the clearing. I positioned them to cover the entrance to the logging road and the area behind the cabin where the tracks were most prominent. As I worked, the woods felt unnervingly silent. The birds had stopped singing and even the wind seemed to have died down. I felt like I was walking through a graveyard. That evening I stayed inside and locked every window and door, bracing them with heavy furniture. I kept all the lights off, hoping to remain inconspicuous. Around 10:00 p.m. the wind picked up, howling through the ridges. Through the whistle of the gale I heard a metallic clink, the sound of one of my trail cameras being struck. I moved to the window and peeked through a small gap in the curtains. In the strobe-like flashes of lightning from a passing storm, I saw it. The figure from the photos was standing in the middle of the clearing. Up close it was even more horrific. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, its body impossibly thin and skeletal. Its skin was the color of wet charcoal and its arms hung down past its knees. It wasn't looking at the cabin, it was systematically tearing my trail cameras off the trees and crushing them in its elongated hands. It moved with a twitching, sporadic motion, its head snapping from side to side. Then it stopped. It slowly turned its torso toward the cabin window, and though I couldn't see eyes in the darkness of its face, I knew it was looking directly at the gap in the curtains. It began to move toward the porch, not running, but gliding with a terrifying, predator-like grace. The creature stepped onto the porch, and the heavy floorboards didn't just creak, they groaned under a weight that seemed far greater than its thin frame suggested. I backed away from the window, retreating into the darkest corner of the kitchen, my heart thundering so loudly I was sure it would give me away. Then came the sound that shattered my composure, a soft, rhythmic tapping on the glass. It wasn't aggressive, it was inquisitive, like a child testing the strength of a bubble. The tapping moved from the window to the heavy oak door, followed by that same sandpaper rasping I had heard on the roof. I realized then that the creature wasn't trying to break in, it was waiting. It knew I was trapped. I looked at the back door, then at the small cellar hatch in the floor. My car was parked only 20 feet from the front porch, but the thing was standing right between me and my only escape. The scratching on the door grew louder, more frantic, and then I heard a voice. It wasn't a human voice, but a perfect, distorted mimicry of my own. Is silence empty? It whispered, repeating the very thought I had written in my journal just days before. The realization that it had been close enough to hear me, or perhaps read my mind, sent a wave of cold terror through my limbs. Desperation took over. I grabbed a canister of bare mace and a heavy iron fire poker. If I stayed in this cabin, I was a cornered animal. I waited for the scratching to move toward the side window, and the moment I heard the weight shift off the porch, I threw the front door open. I didn't look, I didn't aim. I just sprinted for the car, screaming at the top of my lungs to startle whatever was out there. I fumbled with the keys, the metal cold and slick in my sweaty palms. As I dived into the driver's seat, a long, charcoal-colored arm slammed against the driver's side window, the force of the blow spiderwebbing the glass. I cranked the engine and shifted into reverse, flooring the accelerator. The tires roared, kicking up mud and gravel as I swung the car around. In the glow of the revering lights, I saw the creature fully for the last time. It was hunched over, its spine protruding in sharp, bony ridges, its faceless head tilted at an impossible angle. It didn't chase me. It simply stood there, watching as I sped down the logging road, hitting every pothole and branch in my path. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station 3 towns away, where the bright fluorescent lights finally made me feel like I was back in the world of the living. The sheriff's deputies who checked the cabin a few days later found the door standing wide open. They found my camera equipment untouched and my tripod still standing in the clearing. However, they couldn't explain the state of the cabin. Every single log on the exterior was covered in deep vertical gouges, as if the entire structure had been shredded by giant claws. My trail cameras were found at the bottom of the ridge, crushed into unrecognizable pieces of plastic and glass. I never went back for my gear. I sold my professional cameras and took a job in a city office surrounded by concrete and people. I still take photos, but only in the bright noon sun, and I never ever zoom in on the shadows. Because I know now that silence isn't empty sometimes, it's just waiting for you to look.